The bullet hit from skull before anyone heard affirmative sinking. That's how it always began, not with a woman, with silence. And then the sudden violent reminder that someone had been watching you long before you knew you were being watched. Her name was Cassandra Westfield. Her call sign was Ghost. And on the morning of November 14th, in the frozen upper elevations of the Colorado Rockies, she was already 2 miles ahead of every person who thought they were hunting her. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we talk about the mountain, before we talk about the 400 soldiers who combed those ridge lines and came back empty-handed, before we talk about the man named Cross and the woman named Brennan and the deal that cost more lives than anyone was willing to count, we need to go back to the beginning, to the phone call, to the mission that wasn't a mission at all, to the trap it started, as most catastrophic things do, with a voice that sounded completely reasonable. Captain Marcus Hayes called Cassandra at 0347 hours on a Tuesday. She was already awake. She was almost always already awake, sitting in the kitchen of a small rented house outside Fort Carson, drinking black coffee and reading a ballistics manual she'd already memorized twice. Sleep had never come easily to her. After 12 years as a Marine Scout sniper, followed by 3 years as a private military contractor, her body had essentially forgotten how to fully stand down. There was always a part of her nervous system that stayed on watch, scanning the perimeter even when there was no perimeter to scan. Hazy's voice was clipped, professional. He had the particular economy of language that comes from years of issuing orders in environments where every extra word is a liability. "We have a situation," he said. "Search and rescue. Helicopter went down in the SRA de Cristo range. Weather window is narrow. I need the best I can get." Cassandra sat down her coffee. "Who else is on the team?" "Sullivan Calloway, 2 Rangers for ground support, and Colonel Brennan is coming in to oversee." That last name made her pause. Colonel Victoria Brennan, her mentor, the woman who had written the field manual that Cassandra had first read at 22 years old and decided in that moment that this was the life she wanted. Brennan was old school in the best possible sense. Rigorous, principled, brutal in her standards, and bottomless in her loyalty to the people who met them. If Brennan was coming personally, this was serious. "What's the payload on the downbird?" Cassandra asked. "Medical equipment. Possibly a survey crew." Hayes paused. Just a heartbeat. So brief. She almost missed it. "We're still confirming." She almost missed it. Almost. But Cassandra Westfield had spent 12 years learning that the things people didn't say were almost always more important than the things they did. That half-beat pause was a pebble dropped into still water. She filed it away, said yes, started packing her kit. She packed for 3 days. She packed her Remington 700 bolt action, her Glock 19 sidearm, her spotting scope, her medical bag, her emergency bivouac, and enough caloric density to sustain high-altitude exertion for 72 hours. She packed her radio. She packed her satellite phone. She packed, almost as an afterthought, a secondary radio that she kept exclusively for off-grid communication. A habit Brennan had drilled into her years ago during a training exercise that had turned real when their primary comms went dark for 18 hours. Always have a way out that no one knows about. Brennan had told her, not because you don't trust your team, because the world doesn't always give you the luxury of trust. At the time, Cassandra had thought it was just Brennan being Brennan. Intense, slightly paranoid, operating at a threat level slightly above what the situation usually warranted. Now, at 34, with enough operational experience to fill a classified file the thickness of a wrist, she understood that Brennan hadn't been paranoid at all. She'd been precise. CTA 1, 500 words. Pause for just a second. What would you do if the mission briefing didn't quite add up? But the person asking was someone you trusted completely. That's the impossible pull Cassandra is already feeling. If this story has you leaning in, if you need to know how this unfolds, hit subscribe. We bring you stories like this every single week. Stories about impossible choices, human courage, and the moments that define us. Now, back to Cassandra. The helicopter insertion went smoothly. Too smoothly in retrospect. The weather was bitter, but cooperative. Visibility at roughly 400 m. Wind from a northwest at 12 knots. temperatures sitting at -14°C at the elevation they were targeting. The Srdito Range in November is not a forgiving landscape. The peaks run like a spine down the western edge of Colorado into northern New Mexico. And at altitude, they carry a particular kind of cold that isn't just temperature, it's presence. It sits inside your lungs. It slows your thinking. It turns the world monochrome. Cassandra was the first one out of the bird. That was always her preference, and the team knew it without being told. She moved to the tree line in 30 seconds, took a knee, swept her sector. Sullivan, big, methodical, former Army Ranger with a jaw like a steel shelf and eyes that cataloged everything, landed behind her and moved right without being signaled. Callaway, the youngest of the group at 27, former Force Recon, landed third and immediately checked the ridgeline line to the north. They were a good team. They moved like a sentence with proper grammar. Each part knowing its function, no redundancy, no waste. Hayes came off the bird last. He stood for a moment in the clearing, looking north, and something in his posture struck Cassandra as wrong. Not wrong like danger wrong. Run like a man who was carrying something heavy and try not to show it. She filed that away, too. The crash site was approximately 2 kilometers northeast, accessible via a narrow drawer that cut between two ridges. According to the mission brief, they were looking for a civilian medical helicopter carrying 4 personnel, possible survivors, possible medical cargo, retrieve, stabilize, extract, straightforward, clean. The kind of mission that gets run a dozen times a year in mountain terrain. They moved in standard patrol formation. Callaway on point. Cassandra and Sullivan on the flanks. Hayes in the center. The 2 Rangers pulling rear security. The snow was deep enough to slow their pace, but not deep enough to be dangerous. They made the draw in 40 minutes. And then Cassandra smelled it. It's a smell that no amount of training can truly prepare you for. And no amount of experience makes easier. It cuts through cold air with a sharpness that seems almost deliberate, as if the human body is designed to recognize it as a warning. Iron and cold, and something underneath that has no clinical name, but that every soldier, every combat medic, every person who has ever stood over a battlefield knows on a primal cellular level. Blood. All blood. A lot of it. She raised her fist. The team stopped through the trees ahead. Approximately 40 m, she could see the wreckage. The helicopter had come down hard, nose first. The rotors sheared off on impact. The fuselage crumpled into a shape that was more abstract than mechanical. One side of it had burned. The metal blackened and twisted. But what drew her attention wasn't the wreckage itself. It was what was arranged around it. The word she would use later in her official debrief was arranged because that was precisely what it was. Not the chaotic scatter of a crash site, not the organic disorder of an accident. What she saw through the trees was deliberate, purposeful, the work of someone who wanted a very specific thing to be found. For bodies laid out in a line. Military uniforms, no weapons. Execution style, 2 rounds each, tight grouping, rear of the skull. Cassandra felt the cold in a different way now. Not the atmospheric cold of the mountain, but the specific cold that starts at the base of the spine and moves upward when the brain processes something that cannot be undone. Contact, she said, her voice perfectly level. Hold position. She moved forward alone, the way she always moved, low, deliberate, scanning, every step placed with precision that was muscle memory by now. She cleared the wreckage perimeter in a wide arc. No heat signatures in the snow. No fresh tracks beyond their own approach route. Whoever had done this was gone, or they were watching from distance. She knelt beside the nearest body. The uniform patches had been stripped. ID tags were gone, but there was something that hadn't been removed. A small tattoo on the left wrist, partially obscured by a sleeve pulled down in the cold. A Ranger tab, the old design, the kind that hadn't been issued since a policy update 3 years prior. These weren't crash victims. These were soldiers. She turned the nearest body slightly and found something else. Something that hit her harder than the execution wounds, harder than the stripped insignia, harder than anything she'd seen in 12 years of combat. His wrists were irradiated, not from the crash, from restraints. He'd been bound before he was shot. Whatever this was, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a rescue mission. Someone had known exactly where these soldiers would be, had known when they would arrive, had tied them up, and executed them cleanly. And then, and this was the part that turned her blood cold, had called in a recovery team. They hadn't called a rescue mission. They'd laid bait. "Hey," she said, turning back toward the tree line where the captain was positioned. Her voice was still level, still professional. But something in it had changed, a frequency beneath the words that anyone who knew her would have recognized immediately. "We need to talk right now." Hayes walked toward her with the careful steps of a man navigating ice. And for the first time since the phone call at 0347, he met her eyes directly. And in those eyes, she saw something that she had not expected. Not guilt, not treachery. Fear, pure, genuine drowning fear. "Cassandra," he said very quietly, "I think we've been set up." The full weight of what that meant took approximately 4 seconds to land. In those 4 seconds, Cassandra's brain ran the calculation with the same dispassionate efficiency that she applied to a long-range shot. Wind, distance, elevation, target movement, time of flight. Except this time, the variables were who knew about this mission, who had access to the insertion coordinates, who had motive to eliminate a team of this composition, and what was the asset, the thing valuable enough to kill for the stripped military cargo. She hadn't noticed it at first, focused as she was on the bodies. But now, sweeping the perimeter again with fresh eyes, she could see the indentations in the snow around the helicopter's cargo bay. Deep rectangular impressions, heavy crates. Whatever had been here had been systematically removed before their arrival. "What was on this bird?" she asked Hayes. Her voice was quiet. The question carried a blade in it. Hayes looked at the smell. He was a competent officer. She'd worked with him on 2 previous operations and respected his tactical instincts. But right now, he had the look of a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd been putting off for too long. And the edge had finally come to him. "I was told it was sensitive equipment," he said. "Survey technology classified contract for a geological survey of potential extraction sites in the southern range. You were told by General Aldridge's office. General Preston Aldridge. The name registered with Cassandra, the way a name registers when you've heard it in context before but never had reason to attach significance to it. High Command Strategic Operations. The kind of name that appeared on authorizations rather than in the field. The kind of general who existed at a layer of the military hierarchy so far removed from the ground that soldiers in the date rarely had occasion to think about him at all. Aldridge authorized this mission through 2 layers of intermediary, his office to the regional command to Hayes. This was Sullivan, who had moved up beside her without being heard, which was, she reflected, both impressive and exactly what she trained him to do. "So, if this goes wrong," Cassandra said slowly, "and the team that came to investigate the crash site also disappears, then no one in Aldridge's chain of command ever touched this directly. It's insulated by 3 layers. Shepard Protocol," Hayes said. The words dropped into the air between them like a stone into deep water. Shepard Protocol. She'd heard the term once 18 months ago in a bar outside Langley from a former intelligence analyst who had consumed enough bourbon to lose the filter between what he knew and what he was supposed to say. She dismissed it at the time as the melodramatic conspiracy thing of a man who was clearly burning out. A rumored internal program, not sanctioned, not official, not acknowledged by anyone in any position to acknowledge it, that existed for the purpose of eliminating witnesses, not enemies, witnesses, people who had stumbled too close to something that Satan people with sufficient rank and insufficient conscience needed to keep buried. A program designed to clean up the edges of operations that couldn't survive scrutiny. And suddenly the 4 executed soldiers and the stripped cargo and a mission brief that didn't quite hit up and Hayes's half-beat pause at 0347 hours. All of it assembled into a shape that was terrifyingly coherent. They were the loose end. All of them. "Where is Colonel Brennan?" Cassandra asked. She'd expected Brennan on the insertion helicopter, but the colonel hadn't been there. And Hayes had offered no explanation. "She's coming in overland." Hayes said she had a separate insertion point. She didn't trust the helicopter route. Of course, she didn't, because Brennan always had the secondary plan, because Brennan had been doing this long enough to know when a mission had a smell to it. And then from the northern ridge line at a distance that Cassandra estimated at approximately 1,200 m, a sound she knew as well as her own breathing. A rifle shot. Not their rifle. Not from their position from above. That just changed everything, didn't it? If this revelation just flipped your understanding of the entire mission, subscribe, because we specialize in stories that defy belief. Stories where the threat isn't who you expected and the trap was set long before anyone arrived. What happens in the next few minutes will decide whether any of them make it off this mountain. Let's continue. The shot came from elevation. Cassandra knew this not from the sound, but from the way the snow exploded beside Hazy's left boot, the angle of the debris spray, the trajectory of the disturbance in the white surface. The shooter was high northeast ridge, approximately 1,200 m, accounting for the elevation differential in the wind direction. She was moving before the snow settled, not toward cover, which would have been the instinctive response. Toward elevation, toward the shooter's line of sight. Because the single most counterintuitive principle of sniper doctrine, and the one most people in a firefight forgot completely, was this. The safest place when a sniper has you in their field of view is directly below them, in the dead ground of their angle. Move laterally, and you're running through their kill zone. Move toward them, and you disappear beneath the minimum elevation of their scope. She covered 20 m in 6 seconds, hit the base of a granite outcropping, and flattened against it. Sullivan was already moving Calloway and the Rangers into the tree line on the opposite side of the draw. Hayes was down, not shut, she realized a split second later, but deliberately prone. Head down, snow in his face, which was a right call. Second shot, higher than the first, which told her the shooter had adjusted for her movement and was recalibrating. They knew where to look. They had eyes on the insertion point before the team arrived, which meant they had surveillance in place before 0600 hours, which meant this wasn't reactive. This wasn't someone who found them by accident. This was a kill team that had been in position for hours waiting. Her radio clicked twice, Sullivan's signal. She pressed the transmit button once in acknowledgement and began moving along the base of the rock face, staying low, using the terrain the way Brennan had taught her. The mountain doesn't care who you are, but it will help you if you know how to ask. She found the angle she needed at the western edge of the outcropping, a gap in the rock that gave her a narrow but functional line of sight up the northeastern ridge. She brought her scope up. The distance was approximately 1,500 m at the angle she was working. Wind had shifted to westerly at roughly 10 knots. Temperature differential between her position and the ridge line was enough to affect trajectory by a measurable margin. She made the calculations in the part of her brain that had long since automated them. The part that ran these numbers the way other people process grammar without conscious effort. Through the scope, the ridge line was initially empty. Snow rock, the skeletal shapes of high-altitude pine, sparse and stunted by altitude and cold. She swept methodically left to right, looking not for a person but for the things people do when they think they are hidden. A shape that was fractionally too geometric. A surface that reflected light at the wrong angle. A disturbance in the snow that didn't match the wind pattern. There behind, a natural rock formation at approximately 1,280 m, tucked into a hollow that offered excellent cover from the valley floor, but was slightly imperceptibly vulnerable from Cassandra's lateral position. A suppressor outline, minimal barrel exposure, a shooter who was very, very good, but not quite as good as she was. She had the shot. Wind corrected, elevation adjusted, accounting for the cold's effect on powder burn velocity. Clean, she could take it in the next 4 seconds. She didn't take it because a sniper at 1,200 m with suppressor and pre-position surveillance wasn't an ambush opportunist. That was professional work, contract-level work, which meant there was almost certainly a second shooter. And the first one's job might be exactly this. Draw return fire, expose the counter-shooter's position, and let number 2 take the shot. She waited. 12 seconds of patience that felt like 12 minutes. The second shooter materialized at 150 m on the western edge of the same ridge. Closer, slightly less concealed, positioned to cover the first shooter's flank. 2 shooters, overlapping fields of fire. A standard Tourson Overwatch configuration. She still didn't fire because she needed information more than she needed a kill. And because something about the first shooter's configuration, the discipline, the specific choice of position, the patience was familiar in a way she couldn't yet name. Her secondary radio clicked. One click, which was a signal that had never been prearranged with her team because it didn't belong to her team. She pressed the receive button, a voice, female, low, accented with something Eastern European that had been partially smoothed by years of professional language discipline. Westfield, I'm not here for you. Cassandra said nothing. The men I am working for are here for you. I am here because I was paid to be here. These are different things. Who sent you? A pause, wind across the ridge, the sound of nothing. The same people who sent your team into a trap. But I am reconsidering my contractual obligations because your Colonel Brennan is someone I have worked beside before in different circumstances, and I do not enjoy what I am being asked to do today. Where is Brennan? Another pause, longer coming from the south approach. But there's a third shooter on that route. He is waiting for her. Cassandra was already moving. She covered the distance to the southern approach at a dead run, pushing through snow that was thigh-deep in the low spots, vaulting deadfall, navigating by the terrain features she'd memorized from the satellite imagery during the insertion brief. The cold was trying to get into her lungs, and she wouldn't let it. Controlled breathing, deliberate pace, the way you move when you know that stopping is not an option. She found Brennan at the edge of a frozen creek bed, approximately 400 m from the crash site. The colonel was moving well, upright, steady, carrying her own Remington 700 over her right shoulder with the casual authority of someone who'd been carrying long guns in mountain terrain since before Cassandra was born. Victoria Brennan was 58 years old. She had iron gray hair, cut short, and practical eyes the color of winter sky in a posture that was so consistently perfect it had stopped seeming deliberate years ago and just became the architecture of who she was. Cassandra had always thought the kind of person that the word formidable was invented for. Brennan saw her coming and didn't stop moving. She just adjusted her angle to intercept and fell in a step beside her without breaking stride. You made the crash site, Brennan said. It wasn't a question. Execution kills. Strip cargo. They were rangers. Cassandra kept her voice low. Hey, says Aldridge's office authorized the insertion. Shepard protocol. Brennan's jaw tightened. A microscopic movement that most people wouldn't have noticed. Cassandra noticed everything. How long have you known? Cassandra asked. Known completely. 48 hours. Brennan's voice was steady, but carrying something underneath. Not guilt. Something more complex than guilt. The weight of a decision made before all the consequences were visible. Suspected for 4 months. I didn't bring it to you until I had enough to be certain, because I wasn't going to hand you a target without giving you the full picture. You could have told me before I walked into this. I needed you in the field for this to like. I needed someone who could improvise when the plan changed a beat. The plan has clearly changed. Cassandra opened her mouth to respond. The shot came from the eastern entry line at approximately 300 m. Not from the ridge, from ground level. Close. Suppressed, but not suppressed enough to mask the supersonic crack of the round. At that distance, Brennan went down. Not in pieces, not dramatically. She went down the way trees go down in a logging cut all at once with a heaviness that was absolute and final. Left side below the shoulder. Cassandra caught her on the way down. One hand already going to the wound, the other sweeping up her rifle. Brennan, stay with me. The colonel's eyes were clay. That was the first thing Cassandra checked, because eyes told you everything. Present, absent, or somewhere in between. Brennan's eyes were completely clear, which meant the shot had missed the spine and the lung wasn't fully collapsed yet. Don't waste time on me, Brennan said. Her voice was controlled, which cost her something. Get the shooter. I'm not leaving you. That's not a request, Cassandra. The use of her full name. Brennan only used it when she was being completely direct. There's a hard drive in my left chest pocket. That drive has everything. Accounts, transfers, contacts, the full network. $380 million in black market arms transactions going back 6 years. Aldridge's name is on 40% of them. Cassandra's hand was already at the wound, applying direct pressure, doing the triage math. The bullet had hit high on the left side below the clavicle, possibly nicking the lung. Serious. Not immediately fatal if treated. Treatable if she stayed and worked on it. You need the drive matters more than I do. That's not sentiment. That is a tactical assessment. Brennan gripped her wrist with a strength that was surprising for a woman bleeding into the snow. Get the shooter. Secure the drive. Get off this mountain. That is your mission now. The Easter tree line, 300 m. The shooter was repositioning. She could see the disturbance in the snow, the small movements of someone who'd taken a shot and was now trying to avoid the counter. Moving south along the tree line, disciplined but not invisible, she flagged Sullivan on the radio, gave him Brennan's position and the wound description. 2 seconds of information, efficient and exact, and then she was moving toward the tree. The shooter was fast. Cassandra closed the distance to 200 meters, and the tree line swallowed her. Dense stands of spruce and fir at this elevation. The ground beneath them broken by exposed roots systems and drifted snow that made every step uncertain. She moved in pursuit, tracking by the signs of passage rather than sight. A compressed footprint, a broken branch at knee height, the slight difference in snow density where a body had brushed against a trunk. She was gaining. At 150 m, she caught a flash of movement between the trees and dove left, hitting the snow as a round passed through the space where her head had been. Close enough that she heard the distinct, intimate whistle of the bullet transit. The counter-hot, she rolled, came up behind a tree trunk, controlled her breathing. Her pursuer had stopped moving, was waiting. This was a different kind of contest now. Not pursuit and flight, but the specific, patient, almost meditative competition of 2 skilled people trying to outthink each other in close terrain. She gave it 60 seconds. In those 60 seconds, she counted on 2 things. First, that the shooter had seen her dive and was now tracking the tree she'd used for cover, waiting for movement. Second, that the shooter was operating on a timeline. With Brennan down and the mission in progress, there would be pressure to confirm kills and extract, and pressure made patient people impatient. On the 43rd second, the shooter moved, and Cassandra was already 3 positions to the right of where the shooter expected her to be. She had the sight line for exactly 1 second. 1 second was enough. She put the shot into the shooter's right shoulder. Deliberate, not lethal. She needed information. She needed to know who this was, and who they worked for, and what the full shape of the operation looked like. Dead shooters answered no questions. The figure went down hard. By the time Cassandra reached them, rifle raised and movement checked, she was looking at a woman, mid-30s, dark hair, short, practical, combat clothing with no insignia, a suppressed accuracy international rifle, and a face that was composed with a thoroughness that suggested considerable practice at composing itself under adverse circumstances. The Eastern European accent from the radio, Anna, Cassandra said, not a question. The woman, Anna, looked up at her from the snow with the particular expression of someone who is in significant pain and choosing not to demonstrate it. Her right arm was incapacitated. The rifle was out of her reach. She was calculating. I told you I was reconsidering. Anna said, you also shot Colonel Brennan. I was paid to shoot Colonel Brennan. I am now in a position to reconsider that decision as well, since it appears I will be unable to complete the original contract. The slight Russian inflection was more pronounced now, either from pain or from reduced reason to conceal it. I have information that is worth more than my continued detention. Cassandra kept the rifle on her. What information? The hard drive your colonel mentioned. She has 1 copy. I have a second. Anna's eyes moved to her left cargo pocket. The network your Aldridge runs is not one operation. It is 7 cells. Aldridge is not one corrupt general. He is one of 3. The mountain was very quiet, somewhere above them on the northern ridge. The other 2 shooters were still in position. Below them, Brennan was losing blood into the Colorado snow. On the radio, Sullivan was managing a situation that had approximately 4 variables too many for comfort. And hey, in a spruce stand at 11,000-foot elevation, Cassandra Westfield was looking at a Russian contract sniper who had just shot her mentor and was now offering her the evidence that could potentially bring down an entire corrupt military network in exchange for what exactly remained to be detainment. "What do you want?" Cassandra asked. Anna met her eyes. "I want to leave today alive with no one following me." "You shot Colonel Brennan. Who will survive?" "I know exactly where I aimed." A pause. "I'm very good at what I do." Cassandra held a rifle on her for 5 more seconds. Then slowly she lowered it. Not because she trusted Anna, not because she decided that the exchange was fair or that letting a contract shooter walk away from wounding her mentor was a decision she could live with easily. She lowered it because she was thinking 3 moves ahead, the way Brennan had taught her. In 3 moves ahead, the evidence on that drive, the full evidence, not just Brennan's copy, but both copies, cross-reference and ironclad, was worth more than the satisfaction of taking Anna into custody. "The drive," Cassandra said. Anna reached slowly into her left cargo pocket with her uninjured arm and produced a small hard drive encased in military-grade waterproof housing. She held it out. Cassandra took it, checked it, pocketed it. "Go," she said, "and understand that this is a one-time calculation. If I see you again under these circumstances, I won't be doing arithmetic." Anna rose carefully, favoring her right side. She looked at Cassandra for a long moment. The look of 2 people who might in a different world have had a different kind of relationship. Then she turned and moved north through the trees and was gone. CTA 3 to the 500 words. "I know it feels impossible from here." Letting her go, with Brennan bleeding in the snow, with a mountain crawling with people trying to kill them. But this is exactly when the rail story begins. If you're invested in seeing whether Cassandra can pull this together, whether justice actually finds the people who set this trap, subscribe now, because what happens next will break your heart and put it back together. Let's find out. She got back to Brennan in 6 minutes. Sullivan had done everything right. Turned considerations, wound packing, positioning to maintain airway and minimize blood loss. He'd done it efficiently and without panic, which was what she expected from Sullivan and why she trusted him with the most important task on the mountain. Calloway was on elevated overwatch, watching the ridgelines. The 2 Rangers, American Deacon, had established a perimeter. Brennan was conscious. Her color was poor, but her eyes were still clear, and she was still doing the thing she always did in a crisis, which was to think. "The shooters on the ridge," she said when Cassandra knelt beside her. 2 shooters still in position. "I have Anna's drive. Combined with yours, we have enough, and you'll let you take it." We reached an arrangement. Brennan's eyes moved to hairs. A long look that contained several things. Assessment, something that might have been approval. And underneath both of those things, the particular sorrow of a person who has spent their life trying to hold a line and has just watched the line move somewhere they didn't choose. "Hey," Cassandra said, turning to the captain, who was positioned to her left. "We need extraction, not through the original route. Whatever route Aldridge's office had visibility on is compromised." "I have a contact," Hayes said. He said it quietly, like a man confessing something outside normal channels. "I never used it because using it meant acknowledging that I thought we might need it." "We need it." He nodded and moved to make the call. Sullivan looked at Cassandra over Brennan's body. His expression was the careful, neutral expression he used when he had something to say that the situation didn't make easy to say. "The 2 ridge shooters," he said, "they haven't engaged since you went into the tree line. They are holding, waiting for confirmation of kills, which means someone is expecting to hear from the team that came in on the ground. And when they don't hear, they'll send something bigger. They had a window. It was narrow, and it was closing, but it was there." Cassandra stood, assessed the terrain in the particular way she'd been doing since she was 22 years old. Not as landscape, but as a series of tactical problems with solutions attached. The crash site was a liability. The draw was exposed. The northern approach was controlled by the ridge shooters. But the western approach, the one that wasn't in the mission brief, the one that required crossing exposed terrain before gaining the protection of the drainage system that ran toward the lower elevation forest, that was viable. Difficult, cold, but viable. "We move west," she said. "Brennan, on a field litter between Sullivan and Merrick Calloway, I want you 50 m ahead and high. Hayes, you stay close to Brennan. Deacon, rear security. She paused. We move in 4 minutes. Move quietly and move fast. No one argued. That was the other thing about a well-built team. When the situation clarified the command structure, they adjusted to it without bruised egos and without debate. Sullivan was already constructing a basic field litter for materials in his pack. Calloway was moving to elevation. The ridge shooters opened up again at the 200-meter mark of their western crossing. Not with the careful precision of the earliest shots with volume, which told Cassandra two things. They'd receive a communication from someone demanding results, and they were transitioning from precision elimination to area suppression. The difference mattered enormously. A precision shooter was trying to hit specific targets. An area suppression element was trying to pin down and contain, waiting for reinforcements. Time had officially become the critical variable. Run, Cassandra said, and they ran. The crossing of the exposed western face of the draw was approximately 300 m of terrain that offered almost no natural cover. Wind scoured rock and compacted snow with scattered trees too small and too widely spaced to provide meaningful protection. Under normal mountain conditions, it would have been a strenuous traverse under fire with a wounded officer on a field litter and incoming rounds raising snow geysers every 15 to 20 m. It was an exercise in the specific kind of courage that isn't dramatic but is absolutely essential. The courage that keeps your legs moving when every cellular instinct is screaming at you to flatten yourself against the ground and become as small as possible. Deacon went down at the 200-meter mark, not from a direct hit. His left boot caught an exposed route beneath the snow, and he went down hard, losing his rifle, rolling into a depression that partially sheltered him. Cassandra covered him, laying down suppressive fire at the ridgeline. Not aimed precisely. There wasn't time for precision, but targeted at the position she'd identified earlier, forcing the shooters to keep their heads down for the 6 seconds it took Deacon to recover his weapon and get back up. They reached the drainage at the base of the western face. The drainage was a shallow gully carved by seasonal snow melt, running roughly southwest and dropping in elevation fast enough that within 200 m of following it, they were in genuine tree cover. Not the sparse high-altitude stuff, but real forest, dense and dark, the kind that swallowed sound and movement and gave you back anonymity. The ridge shooters couldn't follow without compromising their own overwatch position, and coming down off the ridge to pursue on foot would take them at least 20 minutes. Cassandra called the 20 minutes accurately. She also called the fact that they wouldn't wait 20 minutes. Move faster, she said. They extracted from the mountain at 1,347 hours through a fire road that hazes outside contact. A former Air National Guard pilot with apparently no fear of irregular operations used to bring a civilian truck to a cattle gate 3 kilometers from the drainage outlet. Brennan went directly into the vehicle and directly toward the nearest trauma facility that wasn't connected to any military network Hayes had reason to distrust. This meant a civilian hospital 70 miles south, which in other circumstances would have been a logistical nightmare, and in these circumstances was the only option that guaranteed the colonel wouldn't be met in the emergency room by someone whose job was to ensure she didn't leave it. Cassandra rode in the truck bed with Sullivan, watching the road behind them. The mountain was still visible for the first hour of the drive, white and massive and completely indifferent. Its upper elevations already swallowing the crash site and the execution victims and the evidence of everything that had happened there in fresh snowfall that would cover it by nightfall as thoroughly as if it had never occurred. That was the mountain's nature. It didn't preserve it erased. But Cassandra had Anna's hard drive in her chest pocket and Brennan's hard drive in her left cargo pocket, and 12 years of training that had taught her how to tame fragments of information into prosecutable reality. The mountain could erase the physical evidence. The digital trail was a different problem entirely. Sullivan looked at her with the expression he used when he was processing something difficult and wanted to think out loud. The man Hayes mentioned, he said, Shepherd Protocol. You've heard of it before. Once thought it was rumor and the Aldridge connection. Cassandra looked at the mountain. That's not a field problem anymore. That's a law problem. The FBI. No. The word came out flat and immediate. Not official channels. Not yet. Not until we know how deep the contamination runs. She turned to look at him directly. You ever heard of Agent Torres? Sullivan thought about it. FBI Counterintelligence Task Force on Black Market Military Assets. I saw his name on a classified brief 18 months ago. He's been building a case on this network for 2 years independently. He doesn't report to the task force anymore. He reports to himself and sends the results to a deputy director he trusts. She paused. Brennan gave me his contact information a year ago. Told me I'd know when to use it. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. And now I know the next 48 hours moved in a rhythm that Cassandra had learned to recognize over her career. The compressed, slightly surreal quality of time when a situation is operating at emergency speed, but requiring the kind of meticulous patient work that emergency speed normally precludes. They were moving fast and thinking slow simultaneously. And the tension between those two requirements was a specific exhaustion of crisis intelligence work. Brennan was in surgery for 4 hours. The round had indeed partially collapsed her left lung. Inya had been accurate about her own accuracy, which was almost admirable in its perversity. The surgeon told them she would make a full recovery given appropriate rest and follow-up care, and then told them she'd been trying to leave the recovery room within 3 hours of coming out of anesthesia. And could they please talk to her? They talked to her. She told them about Cross. Captain Dalton Cross had been Brennan's protégé, or had presented himself as such for 4 years in the mid-2010s during a period when Brennan was running an advanced scout sniper training program at Fort Benning. He was talented, meticulous. He absorbed everything she taught him with the kind of focused intelligence that made exceptional soldiers. And she had minted him with the particular investment that exceptional teachers put into exceptional students. She had recommended him twice for advancement. She had spoken for him in review boards. She said, with a carefully neutral expression of a person who has processed the full horror of having been deceived by someone they trusted, helped build the career of a man who would later use everything she taught him to hunt the people she cared about. Cross had been recruited into the Aldridge Network approximately 3 years after leaving Benning. His role, his specific specialized role, was exactly what you'd designed for a man with his training and his particular lack of scruple. He was the cleaner, the one they sent when a situation had gotten complicated enough to require someone with tactical precision and no attachment to outcomes. Someone who could be deployed in the field, assess a complex multi-variable threat environment, and systematically eliminate every person who represented a liability. He had been the one who organized the execution of the Rangers at the crash site. He had been the one who designed the insertion trap. He had been the one who positioned the shooters on the ridge. And he was still out there. He won't stop, Brennan said from the hospital bed. And her voice had that quality it got when she was being precise about something that mattered. The protocol is completion. If a Shepherd operation is activated and doesn't achieve full resolution, he escalates until it does. He won't dissipate. He'll adapt and re-engage. Then we don't wait for him to re-engage. Cassandra said, "You go after Cross. You're going off the books completely. There's no sanctioned framework for this. Torres can give you intelligence, but he can't give you cover. If this goes wrong, I know what happens if it goes wrong." Brennan looked at her. The winter sky eyes held something complex and private. "He was my student," she said, and it wasn't an excuse. It was a statement of responsibility, the particular weight that a teacher carries when a student turns. "And you were mine," Cassandra said, "which is why we're going to finish this." A CTA 4,8 million words. Now that's what courage looks like. Choosing to go after the most dangerous man on the mountain off the books with everything on the line. If you're feeling that surge right now, if this story is hitting different, subscribe, because we've got hundreds more stories of human resilience, impossible decisions, and the moments that define character. And trust me, what comes next will blow your mind. Let's continue. Torres came through in 36 hours. He was a compact man, mid-40s, dark eyes, the slightly compressed quality of someone who had spent years being careful about taking up too much space. He'd driven 4 hours from Denver in a rental car registered to a shell company. And he'd arrived at the safe house where Cassandra's team was operating a rented property outside Alamosa that Hayes had secured through channels that had nothing to do with the military, with 2 encrypted drives of his own, a satellite phone, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular conversation for approximately 2 years. "The drives you recovered," he said, "after reviewing the hard drive data, confirm what I've built from the financial side. The arms transfer started in 2019, small enough to stay under threshold, reporting under the radar shipments through shell companies to intermediate buyers who then resold to a network of regional actors. The dollar amount climbed as the operation got more sophisticated. By 2024, they were moving inventory worth tens of millions per quarter. And Aldridge is the architect. Aldridge is the architect of one cell. The others," Torres paused. He had the look of a man who was about to say something that he knew would make a difficult situation more difficult, and was choosing honesty over comfort. "The others are independent franchises. Same methodology, different leadership. The data from Anna's drive gives us 3 names in Aldridge-specific cell, but the broader network that's going to take time. How much time with what you brought me? Months for a comprehensive case. Weeks to move on Aldridge specifically. If we use the hard evidence and put Cross in front of a federal magistrate." Cassandra looked at the map of Montana. She tacked to the wall of the safe house. Torres's intelligence had Cross at a property in the Bitter Valley, a working ranch that served as a safe house for the Shepherd Protocol's Western operational team. Remote, well-positioned, defendable, but not invincible. She had Sullivan, Calloway, Hayes, Merrick, and she had everything Brennan had taught her about reading terrain and reading people and understanding that the mountain always had a weakness. You just had to be patient enough to find it. "We move in 72 hours, she said. Cassandra Torres used her name with the care of someone who wanted to be heard. "This needs to be done in a way that produces a viable prosecution. We need Cross alive. We need testimony. If this turns into a kill operation, it won't. You've been in the Rockies for 3 days. You've been shot by a Russian contract sniper, 2 ridge position snipers, and a team that executed 4 ranges. You're running off book with no official sanction. And you want me to trust that this will be clean. I want you to trust that I understand the difference between justice and revenge." She held his gaze. "They feel similar from the outside. They are very different from the inside." Trace looked at her for a long moment. Then he pushed one of his encrypted drives across the table. "Everything I have on the Montana property," he said. "Satellite imagery, known occupants, security rotation schedule, and Cross's personal communication patterns. He uses a specific encryption protocol that his team hasn't updated in 18 months, which means we can predict his internal communication timing." "Thank you." "Don't thank me." Bring him back breathing. The drive to Montana took 12 hours. They drove in 2 vehicles, staying off the interstate for the last 3 hours and using secondary roads that added time but removed exposure. The Bitter Valley in November was dramatic in the particular way of the Northern Rockies. The mountains to the west running in a continuous wall that caught the last light of the afternoon and held it until it turned from gold to copper to a dark red that looked, Cassandra thought, like something in the process of becoming something else entirely. She drove the second vehicle alone, letting Sullivan take the first with Hayes and Merrick, and Calloway stretched in the back seat, catching 2 hours of sleep before the operation. She drove, and she thought, and the thinking she did in those 12 hours was the kind of thinking that you do before something that might end badly. Not pessimistic, not catastrophizing, but honest, accounting for the full weight of the situation and choosing in full possession of that weight to carry it forward anyway. She thought about Brennan in the hospital bed in Alamosa with her partial lung collapse, and her winter sky eyes, and her refusal to apologize for putting Cassandra in the field blind because the field was where Cassandra did her best work. She thought about the 4 Rangers laid out in the snow. She thought about Hayes and his half-beat pause at 0347 hours and the fact that he'd called her anyway. Because even if he hadn't been certain, even if he'd been used and manipulated and walked into a trap himself, he'd still called the one person he knew could handle what was on the other side of it. She thought about Cross, the man who had sat in Brennan's classroom and absorbed everything she knew and then turned it against her with the specific clinical efficiency of someone who had decided that certain principles were optional when sufficient money was in play. And she thought about Anna walking through the spruce trees with her wounded shoulder and her recovered drive, disappearing into the mountain the way people who do what she did disappeared smoothly, completely, as if they'd never been there at all. Inya, who had shot Brennan and then helped her, who had been paid to participate in a trap and then handed over the evidence that might undo it, who occupied a moral category that didn't have clean edges and probably never would. The road curved west, and the Bitter Mountains came into full view, massive and white and absolute in the dying light. She put her foot down and drove toward them. The Montana property was exactly what Torres's satellite imagery had shown. A working ranch of approximately 300 acres with a main house, 2 outbuildings, and a barn that the imagery suggested had been significantly reinforced beyond normal agricultural requirements. The approach from the east was open ground. The approach from the north was a tree line approximately 800 m from the main structure. The south was a frozen creek and then rising terrain that eventually connected to the ridge system above. Callaway took the ridge. This had been the plan's single most important element, and it was the element Cassandra had spent the most time on. Callaway was 27 Force Recon and the best precision shooter on the team after Cassandra herself. He was also carrying Brennan's Remington 700, the same rifle the colonel had been carrying on the mountain, which Sullivan had recovered from the snow near the crash site and carried out without being asked to. It was an act of the kind of instinctive loyalty that doesn't need to be articulated, the kind that makes teams more than the sum of their parts. Callaway moved to his ridge position in the pre-dawn dark at 0430 hours, giving him a full 2 hours before the operational window. He confirmed his position at 0445. Wind northwest 9 knots. Distance to main structure 780 m. Clear line of sight. Sullivan and Merrick took the north tree line. Hay stayed with the vehicles at the secondary egress point 3 miles east. Not because he wasn't capable of the operational role, but because someone needed to manage Torres's communication channel and ensure that federal custody was positioned and ready before Cross was in hand. Cassandra went straight to the front door. This was the part of the plan that Sullivan had objected to in the safe house and objected to again in the vehicle and been overruled on both times. His objection was operationally sound. Going direct alone into a defended structure occupied by a man who was professionally trained and deeply motivated to ensure she didn't leave it alive was not a tactically optimal approach. His objection was completely correct, but his objection assumed that the goal was tactical optimality and Cassandra's goal was something different. Her goal was a conversation before a kill shot became necessary. Her goal was crossing custody and talking because cross-talking was worth infinitely more than cross-dead. And her goal, the one she hadn't said out loud, but that live in the space between every word she'd spoken since Brennan's blood hit the Colorado snow, was to look at the man who'd done this and let him see that it hadn't worked. That mattered to her. She knew it was personal. She accepted the personal. She knocked on the front door at 0620 hours. Cross opened it himself, which told her immediately that the security rotation Torres had outlined was accurate and that the guard cycle was on its outward sweep, leaving the main house temporarily with only Cross and one additional occupant. She'd counted on this. She'd also counted on something Torres had noted almost as a footnote in his intelligence package that Cross had a habit of reviewing communications personally in the early morning alone before the rest of the operational team was fully active. Habits, every professional had them, and habits, more than any other single variable, were what got professionals killed. Cross was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, lean with a particular physical economy of a man who had spent his adult life in physical discipline. Dark hair going gray at the temples. The face of someone who had made a decision a long time ago about what kind of person they were going to be and had spent the subsequent years becoming it very thoroughly. He was wearing civilian clothes, but moved in them the way military people moved, with a bearing that clothing didn't change. He recognized her in the half-second it took for his eyes to complete their initial scan. And in the moment of recognition, she saw several things pass through his expression in rapid succession. Surprise, assessment, calculation, and then settling over all of it like a layer of frost. a professional composure that was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Westfield, he said, his voice was even measured. He'd been trained. She reflected by the same woman who trained her. Cross. She had the Glock in her right hand. Held low, not pointed at him yet, but present. A statement of fact rather than a threat. We should talk. Talk. He stepped back from a doorway. An invitation or a tactical adjustment or both. You came alone for the conversation, not for what comes after if the conversation doesn't go well. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man trying to calculate odds. She let him look. She'd made the same calculation herself more than once in the past 72 hours, and she'd reached the same conclusion each time. This was going to resolve one way or another, and the way it resolved was going to depend on which of them had the longer frame. Brennan is alive, Cassandra said. Something moved in his face. Just a fraction, just enough to confuse. That Cross, for all his professional disassociation from outcome, had not been completely indifferent to the question. And Anna gave you the drives, he said, which means you have the financial documentation. Both copies combined. Trace has been building a financial case for 2 years. Your operation just finished it for him. She kept her voice steady and factual. The tone of someone presenting a situation rather than arguing about it. Aldridge is going to be charged. The question is whether those charges include your cooperation or your cops. Cross was quiet for a moment. The house was very still. The specific stillness of a place that knows it's being surrounded, even if it can't articulate that knowledge. You understand what happens to me if I cooperate. You said you live. You serve time. And the people who gave you your orders, the people who built this network above your head and used you as a disposable piece of it, they face real consequences for the first time. She paused, or you make a move right now, and Calloway puts a round through this window from the ridge at 780 m, and we end this conversation permanently. Cross looked at the window. Look back at her. You're bluffing. Oh my. She held his eyes. You trained under Brennan for 4 years. So did Calloway. She taught both of you, which means right now the man on the ridge is looking through a scope that your mentor taught him to use, aiming at a man your mentor taught to fight. And the question is whether she taught the two of you differently enough that one of you ends this morning and one of you doesn't. A long silence, the kind of silence that precedes a decision. Cross sat down slowly in the chair beside the communications table. His hands went to his knees, visible and still. Cool, Torres, he said. She was already reaching for the radio. The shot came from inside the house. Not from Cross, from the room at the back. The second occupant, who Torres's intelligence had logged as a security specialist named Harker, who had apparently not been on the outward guard rotation after all, or who had returned early, or who had been awake and listening and making his own calculation about how this morning was going to resolve. It hit Cassandra in the left arm above the elbow. Not catastrophic. It missed the bone, missed the brachial artery, passed through soft tissue, but knocked her backward, and the Glock went wide, and Haka was already through the doorway, moving toward her. Cross moved faster. He came out of the chair with a speed that was at odds with his deliberate calm of a moment before, and he hit Harker with the full force of a man who had made a decision and was now on the other side of it. 2 strikes, controlled, precise, anatomically targeted. Haka went down and didn't get up. Cross stood over him, breathing hard, and looked at Cassandra. She had the Glock back in her hand, pointed at Cross. He had his hands up. Still want that conversation, he said. Outside, she heard Sullivan and Merrick hitting the outbuilding. No shots, which meant the guard rotation was being handled. Through the window, the early Montana light was beginning to fill the valley. She lowered the Glock. Torres is 2 hours out, she said. Her left arm was bleeding into her sleeve. She would deal with it. You're going to spend those 2 hours telling me everything. Cross sat back down, and he began to talk. Dalton Cross talked for 2 hours and 14 minutes. He talked about Preston Aldridge and the network's architecture, the 7 cells. Torres had mentioned the franchise model that was designed to ensure no single operational failure could collapse the whole structure. He talked about Shepard Protocol's origins, which trace back not to recent corruption, but to a contingency framework developed in the early 2000s as a classified internal mechanism for eliminating intelligence liabilities during the post-911 information environment. Subsequently captured and reproved by a small group of senior officers who understood that the same machinery that had been built to protect national security could be turned with minimal modification toward protecting personal financial interests. He talked about the $380 million, where it had gone, how it had been distributed, which shell companies carried, which portions of it, and which foreign intelligence services had been the end buyers for the arms that had passed through the network's logistics chain. He talked about the Rangers who had been executed at the crash site. He talked about them without the composure he'd maintained for the first 30 minutes of the conversation. And that was a moment when Cassandra understood something important about Cross, that the man who had ordered those deaths was not entirely comfortable with having ordered them, which didn't excuse it and didn't mitigate it, but did mean that the conscience was still partially present, still capable of something like suffering, and that suffering was going to be useful in front of jury. He talked about Colonel Victoria Brennan. He talked about her for longer than he talked about anything else, about how he tracked her investigation. The 4-month window when she'd been quietly building her own case against the network, working independently using contacts and methods that her 4 years mentoring him had given her every reason to believe he knew nothing about how Aldridge's intelligence had identified her as a liability approximately 6 weeks before the Colorado operation, about how Cross had been given the assignment to handle it personally because of his connection to her. Because the network's logic was that a student eliminating a mentor was a contained story, a personal grievance made to look professional, clean, and unrelated to anything larger about how he had known when he accepted the assignment exactly what he was accepting. And you took anyway, Cassandra said. Cross looked at his hands. Yes. Why? A long pause. The honest pause of a man who has had 2 hours of conversation to get comfortable with honesty and is finding the question still difficult because I had convinced myself. He said finally that the network's goals serve a larger strategic purpose, that the arms going into certain regions were actually stabilizing them, that the money was enabling operations that official channels couldn't touch. I had built a very sophisticated argument for myself about why what I was doing was necessary. And now he looked up. Now I'm sitting in my own safe house with a bullet hole in my security specialist and an FBI agent 2 hours away. The argument doesn't seem as sophisticated anymore. Torres arrived at 0834 hours with 4 federal agents and a federal magistrate's authorization that had been issued that morning on the basis of the hard drive documentation. Cross was taken into custody in the front yard of the ranch as the morning light came full into the Bitter Valley, making the mountains on the western side of it enormous and white and absolutely indifferent to the proceedings below. He went quietly. He'd given his word during the 2-hour conversation, and Cassandra had believed it, not because she thought Cross was a good man, but because she thought he was a precise one, and precise people, when they decided to do a thing, generally followed through. Merrick had taken a round through the vest during the outbuilding clearance. Bruised ribs, possible hairline fracture, no penetration. He was mobile and irritated and refused to be carried to the vehicles, which was consistent with everything she knew about him. Sullivan was completely uninjured and unreasonably calm about it, which was also consistent with everything she knew about him. Calloway came down from the ridge, carrying Brennan's Remington 700 over his shoulder, and walked across the open ground to where Cassandra was standing and handed her the rifle without saying anything. She took it and held it for a moment. The stock was cold from the hours at altitude. She could feel the weight of it, which was not just the weight of the metal and the wood, but the weight of everything that had been carried with it. The training and the principle and the particular kind of love that exists between a teacher and a student who both take their craft seriously enough to give their full selves to it. She put it over her own shoulder and walked to the vehicle. The charges came down 41 days later. General Preston Aldridge, 4-star decorated 40 years of service, was indicted on 17 federal counts, including conspiracy, weapons trafficking, obstruction of justice, and the ordering of the execution of 4 United States Army Rangers. The indictment ran to 230 pages. The financial evidence alone occupied 63 exhibits. Two of the three other generals connected to the broader network were named in associated indictments filed simultaneously in three different federal jurisdictions. The third, a retired two-star with known health issues, died of a heart attack 12 days before his indictment was to be filed, which was either a remarkable coincidence or final act of self-determination that no one was in a position to confirm. Cross's cooperation was cited in the indictment language as materially contributing to the prosecution's case. He entered a plea agreement that included significant federal time and full continuing cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the remaining network cells. The court-martial proceedings for connected military personnel took another 4 months. And on a Thursday afternoon in February at a ceremony at Fort Bragg, attended by Cassandra Sullivan Calloway Hayes Merrick and a recovered Colonel Victoria Brennan, who stood through the entire ceremony with her back straight and her hands still and her winter sky, eyes bright with something that wasn't quite anything you could name precisely. Preston Aldridge's conviction included a judicial finding that the charges that had been quietly attached to Kel Brennan's operational record 4 years ago were false, fabricated as part of the network's effort to discredit her independent investigation. The false traitor label that had shadowed her death because she had been presumed dead incorrectly in a classified incident 4 years prior that was itself connected to the network's containment activities was officially expugned. And 2 months after that, in a ceremony that Cassandra attended in her dress uniform, Carol Victoria Brennan received the Medal of Honor, posthumous technically, because the citation addressed events 4 years in the past when Brennan had been listed as killed. The bureaucratic machinery of the military couldn't entirely reconcile the living woman standing in front of it with the dead woman it was citing, and so it honored both with the same action and let the contradiction stand which Cassandra thought was appropriate in its way. Brennan accepted the medal with the same bearing she brought to everything. Straight back, hand still, face composed. And then she looked at Cassandra across the ceremony space with those winter sky eyes, and something passed between them that had no name in any language and didn't need one. Stories like this remind us what we're capable of, don't they? If you're feeling something right now, if this moment landed, subscribe. Because we believe stories have the power to change how we see the world. Stories about people who refused to let the truth stay buried, who paid the full cost of doing right, and came out the other side changed but unbroken. We've got so many more to share. Now, let's go back for the ending. The victory was real. Let that be clay. For Rangers whose names have been stripped from their uniforms and whose executions have been designed to vanish into a mountain snowfall now had federal motor charges attached to the man who ordered them. A corrupt general who had spent 6 years treating the United States military as a personal arms bazaar was facing the rest of his life in a federal facility. A woman who had been falsely labeled a traitor wore the Medal of Honor on a uniform that the military would now have to look at and acknowledge it had gotten profoundly, inexcusably wrong. These are not small things. They were the things that people died for in the most literal sense. And they had happened because a small group of people had chosen, at considerable personal cost, to not let the mountain bury what the mountain was designed to bury. The victory was real. But Cassandra had learned in 12 years of looking through a scope at distances that made other people's full confidence seem like optimism. That the question you asked after a victory was always the same question. She had learned it from Brennan, who had learned it from someone before her, who had probably learned it from someone before that. The unbroken chain of people who understand that the world doesn't actually stop when the shooting does. The question was simple. What's still out there? She had not heard from Anna in the 4 months since the mountain. She had not expected to. Anna was the kind of professional who had been disappearing effectively since before Cassandra had her first scope assignment. And the fact that she'd handed over evidence and walked away in the snow of the SRA to Christos didn't mean she'd become findable. If anything, it meant the opposite, that she understood the value of the gesture precisely because it cost her something, and that having paid that cost, she was now interested in maximum distance from the consequences. So when the plain white envelope appeared under the door of Cassandra's apartment in Arlington on a Wednesday evening in early March, she recognized the nature of it before she opened it. Not because she knew Anna's methods with precision, because she recognized the handwriting of someone who was careful without being elaborate. Someone who communicated exactly as much as they intended to communicate and not one syllable more. Inside the envelope was a single index card. On the index card, 5 lines of text. No greeting, no signature, the lines read. Cross was 1 cell. Aldridge was 1 general. The network has 6 remaining functional nodes. 2 of the 3 corrupt generals are still active duty. They know you by name, and they are patient. They will collect what they are owed. Not now. Later. Cassandra read it 3 times. Then she set it down on the kitchen table and stood at the window, looking out at the Arlington night, the city lights, the traffic below, the ordinary world moving through its ordinary evening with no particular awareness of the architecture of compromised authority and weaponized loyalty and cascading consequence that existed inside and alongside it, invisible until it wasn't. She thought about Brennan's medal. She thought about the Rangers. She thought about Cross sitting in a federal holding facility, working through his cooperation agreement carefully and precisely because that was how he did everything. She thought about Sullivan and Calloway and Hayes and Myrick scattered, now back to their various postings and lives connected by shared experience in the way that people who have survived something together are connected permanently and without requiring maintenance. She thought about the mountain, the way it looked from the truck bed on the drive south, white and massive and completely indifferent, already erasing the evidence of what had happened there. She thought about patience, about the specific cold, strategic patience of people who understood that the optimal move was not always the immediate move, about the fact that the network had been building for 6 years before anyone found the thread, and that 6 years of careful work doesn't disappear because 1 cell gets rolled up and 1 general gets indicted. 6 remaining notes, 2 active duty generals, patient, adaptive, watching. She picked up the index card again and read it a 4th time. The last line, they will collect what they are owed. She put the card in her chest pocket, walked to her bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for 3 minutes, which was how long she gave herself for the particular unavoidable weight of a situation that had no clean edges. 3 minutes. Then she turned on the light. She opened her laptop and pulled up a blank document and began typing. Not a report, not a formal intelligence product. The beginning of a working document. The kind that started with everything you knew and organized it until you could see the shape of what you didn't know yet. The kind that Brennan had taught her to build at the beginning of every operation. Back when operations was something a chain of command assigned and resources was something a budget provided. Back before she learned that the most important operations were the ones that no one officially assigned. The cursor blinked in the white space of the blank document. Outside the Arlington night, moved through its ordinary business somewhere in a direction that Cassandra couldn't yet name with the precision she would eventually need. 6 network nodes were operating with the quiet confidence of people who had survived the loss of 1 cell and had already adapted their posture accordingly. 2 generals wore their uniforms to work in the morning. Money moved through accounts that Torres's team hadn't found yet. Decisions were made in rooms that didn't officially exist about assets and liabilities and the long, patient calculus of when to move and when to wait. And in a location that was impossible to determine from a white envelope and a 5-line index card, a woman with dark hair and a healed right shoulder sat in whatever approximation of stillness she maintained between assignments, watching a situation she had partially helped create and partially helped unravel, waiting to see which way it resolved and which way it needed her. The victory was real. The war was not over. Cassandra Westfield looked at the blank document for exactly 4 seconds. Then she began to type. What they would discover later in the depositions and the classified briefings and the forensic accounting that would occupy the next 2 years of Torres's professional life was that the Shepard Protocol had not been designed as a network. It had been designed as a virus, decentralized, self-replicating, capable of losing entire sections of itself without losing its fundamental function. Cross had known about 1 cell. Aldridge had known about 3. The person who had designed the original architecture, whose name did not appear on any of the hard drives, whose fingerprints were not on any of the financial documentation, whose connection to the network existed in the space between official decisions rather than in the decisions themselves, had known about all 7. And they were not, as it turned out, one of the 3 generals. But that story comes later. The Bitter Valley in the rearview mirror, the Colorado Rockies in the early winter of a year that had already cost more than most. The smell of blood in cold air, and the specific weight of a rifle that belonged to a woman who was alive when she should have been dead, carrying a name that was clear when it should have been buried. There's a version of this story that ends with the ceremony with the medal with Cross in custody and Aldridge in chains, and the ceremony at Fort Bragg, and the look that passed between Cassandra and Brennan across the formal space of military acknowledgement. That version is true. Those things happened. But the version that is truest is the one that continues past the ceremony, past the handshakes and the citations and the restoration of records that should never have been corrupted. The version that follows Cassandra back to the apartment in Arlington, to the white envelope under the door, to the blank document, and the blinking cursor, and the quiet absolute decision to continue, because that is what the people who do this work understand eventually if they stay at it long enough. The mountain doesn't give you an ending. It gives you a position, and from that position you look out through the scope of the distance, and you make your adjustments for wind and elevation and the cold that slows everything down, and you wait for the moment when the calculation is right. Cassandra Westfield was very good at waiting. She had learned from the best, and she was just getting started. The document on Cassandra's laptop had 4 to 7 pages by the end of the first week. Not 4 to 7 pages of polished prose. 4 to 7 pages of the specific, unglamorous architecture of a working intelligence product. Fragmented notes connected by arrows. Financial transaction strings that terminated in shell company names that terminated in other shell company names. Personnel files cross-referenced against deployment records. And at the center of all of it, a single question written in capital letters that she returned to every time she felt the document threatening to collapse under its own complexity. Who built the protocol? Not who ran it. Not who benefited from it. Not who executed its operations or managed its financial flows or provided the senior authority that gave it operational cover. Those questions have been substantially answered by Cross's testimony and the hard drive documentation and Torres's 2 years of patient forensic accounting. The question was who had designed it, who had looked at the existing machinery of classified military contingency planning and seen in that machinery not just a tool for protecting national security, but a template for protecting personal interests at a scale that required the kind of institutional infrastructure that only people inside the institution could build. That person had been careful, precisely, deliberately careful, so careful that their carefulness itself had become the one visible signature. Every piece of documentation that should have included their name didn't. Every decision that should have left a trace had been made through intermediaries who were themselves intermediaries. Every financial connection that led toward them led instead to an empty room. You couldn't be that consistently invisible without working at it, which meant they were still working at it. On day 8, Torres called. Cross gave us something, he said without preamble. His voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone managing a piece of information that wanted to move faster than he was allowing it to. In his last deposition session, he was careful about it, framed it as an analytical inference rather than direct knowledge, but the FBI analysts say it's solid. What did he give you? A name. Not the architect, but the person who recruited the architect. A pause. Cross calls him the shepherd. Not Shepherd Protocol, just a shepherd. A single individual who identified and recruited the generals and built the financial infrastructure. Someone who, according to Cross, has never once appeared in any official record connected to the network because they are not and have never been military. Cassandra was very still civilian, private sector, defense contracting. Torres thinks based on the financial methodology, the way the network is structured mirrors very specific accounting practices that the forensic team has only ever seen in one sector. Cross doesn't know who it is. Cross knows they exist, has never had a name, never had a face, never had a direct interaction. But he says that Aldridge referred to this person 3 times in conversations crossover. And each time Aldridge used the word architect with a capital A reverence that suggested this wasn't a peer relationship. Aldridge worked for the shepherd. That's Cross's inference, which means a four-star general with 40 years of service and 17 federal charges was essentially a mid-level manager in someone else's organization. The implications assembled themselves in Cassandra's mind with a particular speed of a pattern that has been partially visible for a long time, suddenly completing itself. Torres, the two active duty generals named in Anna's note, General Richard Hogrove, Defense Intelligence Agency, and General Calvin Marsh, Army Material Command. Torres's voice was measured, both still in their positions, both aware that Aldridge is cooperating, both aware that the investigation is expanding, so they're not sitting still. No, a longer pause. Cassandra, in the last 6 days, 3 of Torres's field contacts who had peripheral knowledge of the network have had accidents. 1 vehicular, 1 apparent cardiac event, 1 missing. The word accident sat in the air between them with a weight of something that was not accidental at all. How long do we have before Harrove and Marsh untouchable? She asked. Legally, months minimum. Procedurally, the DOJ is moving carefully because these are active duty 4 stars and a wrongly assembled prosecution is worse than no prosecution. Porzy's voice dropped. Practically, I think we have a window of approximately 3 weeks before the network adapts its containment posture completely and buries what it can't remove. 3 weeks. Cassandra closed the laptop and looked at the wall. 3 weeks to find the thread that connected Hogrove in Marsh to the financial documentation. 3 weeks before the network, patient adaptive, already restructuring around the loss of Aldridge Cell, completed whatever defensive maneuver it was currently executing. 3 weeks before the people who had put 4 Rangers in the snow and sent a kill team into the Colorado Rockies and tried to erase everyone who saw it too much completed the recalibration and disappeared back into the institutional structure that had generated them. She reached for her phone and called Sullivan. "How fast can you get to Arlington?" she asked. Sullivan characteristically did not ask why. 8 hours, he said. Less if I break things. Break things? She said. Sullivan arrived at 7 the following morning with a duffel bag and a coffee. He took one look at the 4 to 7-page working document spread across 3 connected monitors and said nothing for approximately 90 seconds, which was Sullivan's version of being genuinely impressed. Calloway arrived 4 hours later from Virginia Beach, still carrying the particular settled stillness he'd had since the Montana morning. Not cold, not distant, but the quality of a person who had done something that had permanently rearranged certain interior furniture and was still in the process of deciding where everything now belonged. He'd been 27 years old when he took that ridge shot from 800 using Brennan's Remington 700. He was still 27 4 months later, and the distance between those 2 versions of the same age was measurable in ways that had nothing to do with calendars. He sat down, looked at the monitors, and said, "What do we need?" That was the team. That was always the team. Hayes joined remotely from Fort Carson on an encrypted line, his face on a laptop screen, carrying the careful, slightly compressed expression he wore when he was simultaneously a serving military officer and something that the chain of command would not sanction. He'd been managing that particular internal tension since Colorado with the professionalism of a man who had decided that some chains of command had forfeited the right to define the limits of his loyalty. Merrick was still recovering from the Montana ribs, also remote from a hospital in Missoula, and he made clear in the first 30 seconds of the call that his participation was not optional regardless of his current medical status. Torres has Harrow's financial network partially mapped. Cassandra began. Hogrove is cleaner than Aldridge. He understood from the beginning that direct financial connection was a liability. So he used a laying structure that puts 4 shell entities between his personal accounts and any network transaction. But the layering has a pattern. The same accounting firm appears in the corporate registration filings for 3 of the 4 shell entities. FOAM is called Meridian Structured Capital, registered in Delaware. Operational address in McLean, Virginia. Man, Sullivan said, not a question. McLean, Virginia. The specific postal code of the intelligence community where defense contractors and former agency personnel and private equity firms with classified client lists occupied office parks that looked identical to office parks everywhere and were functionally nothing of the kind. Meridian's senior partner, Cassandra, continued, is a man named Elliot Vance, 61 years old, former DI analyst, left government service in 2009, built Meridian over the following 8 years. Clean public record, no flags, impeccable professional reputation in the defense contracting community. She paused. He is also the shepherd. The room was quiet. You're certain, Calloway said. Torres is certain. Cross's deposition described the shepherd as someone with DIA background, defense, contracting connections, and a specific operational philosophy. That military corruption was not a moral failure, but a market inefficiency, and that the right structure could money inefficiency at scale indefinitely as long as the people managing it never made the mistake of caring about outcomes. She looked at the screen. That's a quote. According to Torres. Cross heard it secondhand from Aldrich, but it's also the precise philosophical DNA of how Meridian is structured as a business. Torres's analysts matched the language patent to 3 published papers Vance wrote in 2011 and 2012 under a corporate research imprint. Sullivan leaned back in his chair. He had the expression he got when the problem had clarified enough to move from analysis to planning. So we have Vance as the architect, Harrove and Marsh as active duty network generals, 6 remaining operational cells in 3 weeks before the whole structure goes into lockdown. That's the situation. And Torres can't move on Vance directly because the financial evidence against Vance is strong enough to indict, but not yet strong enough to convict. Vance has spent 15 years building legal insulation that will survive a standard prosecution. What Torres needs. Cassandra pulled up a specific section of the working document is testimony. Direct testimony from someone inside the network who dealt with Vance personally. And there is exactly one person alive who has that. Cross dealt with Vance. Cross dealt with an intermediary, but there is one other person. She looked at the monitors. The person who recruited Cross into the network originally, who has been since Cross's arrest, completely unreachable through any official channel, who has a direct relationship with Vance going back to 2017. She pulled up a file photograph, a woman, mid-40s, severe professional appearance, the specific composure of someone for whom composure was a professional asset. Deputy Director Sandra Okafor Cassandra said, Defense Intelligence Agency, Richard Hogro's direct subordinate, and Vance's longest-tenured network, contact the silence in the room, had a different quality. Now she's DI Hayes said from the screen, his voice careful. If she knows the investigation is expanding, she already knows she's been inside the FBI's investigation timeline since Torres's first briefing reached DIA channels. 6 months ago, Cassandra looked at him, which means every move Torres has made in the last 6 months, she's known about. Then how is Torres still? Because Torres is not an idiot and has been running a parallel track that DI doesn't have visibility on a beat. The track we're currently operating on. Wait, did you catch that? The FBI's own investigation has been compromised from the inside. And the one person who can bring the whole structure down is the one person who's been watching it fall apart from front row seat. If your mind is turning right now, if you're thinking there's no way out of this, subscribe because we specialize in exactly these stories, the ones that seem impossible until the moment they aren't. Now, here's what Cassandra does next. Finding Okafor took 11 days, not because she was hidden in any dramatic sense. She was still reporting to DIA headquarters in Bethesda, still attending in agency meetings, still performing the full, careful choreography of a senior official with nothing to hide. She was hidden in the more dangerous and more common sense. She was invisible because she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, and the people who might have looked at her more carefully had every institutional reason not to. Torres found a thread through financial forensics, a payment structure that connected Meridian Structure Capital to a personal investment account held by a blind trust in Okafor's husband's name, distant enough to require 3 forensic accountants and 12 days of documentation work to establish, but real, documented, admissible. The amount was $2.3 million transferred in 6 installments over 4 years. She'll lawyer up the moment we approach officially. Torres said she has enough warning and enough legal preparation that a standard approach produces nothing, but a very expensive stalemate. So we don't approach officially. Cassandra said. Torres was quiet for a moment. Cassandra, she recruited Cross. Cross is cooperating. Cross can get her to a meeting on the basis that he has information she needs about what exactly he has disclosed and what he hasn't. She laid it out cleanly the way she laid out a shot calculation. Each element following from the previous, the logic is clean as ballistics. She comes to the meeting believing she's managing a liability. She leaves it having provided enough recorded conversation to complete Torres's evidentiary package. That's a sting operation run by a non-FBI asset using a federal cooperative witness. Yes, the legal complications of that are Torres's problem if it works, and everyone's problem if it doesn't. She met his eyes through the screen. You told me 3 weeks. We 11 days. How is your timetable looking? Torres's jaw tightened. He picked up a pen, set it down. The calculation of a man weighing institutional risk against the cost of inaction, which was a calculation that Cassandra had made herself on a mountain in Colorado. At the moment, she lowered her rifle and let Anna walk into the spruce trees. Set it up, he said. The meeting happened in a parking structure in Bethesda on a Thursday afternoon. Cross called Okafor from a monitored line using a script that Torres's team had built from Cross's direct knowledge of how Okafor communicated under pressure, her specific linguistic patterns, the particular phrases she used when she wanted to signal urgency without creating a record that could be characterized as urgency. The call lasted 4 minutes. Okafor agreed to the meeting in 90 seconds, which Torres noted was significantly faster than her typical decision cadence, and suggested she was more concerned about Cross's cooperation than she'd been showing. She came alone. She was careful. She ran a counter-surveillance route before entering the structure, used a vehicle registered to her husband's business, and wore civilian clothes with no identification. She was professional. She was experienced. She was by every observable measure extremely good at what she did. She was also, as Torres had calculated, so focused on managing Cross that she didn't clock the 3 FBI surveillance units positioned on floors 2, 3, and 5 of the structure or the recording equipment that had been in place since 6 that morning. Cross met her on level 4. He was composed. He was precise. He said exactly what the script said to say and let her say what she needed to say in response. And what she said in the specific, careful, technically deniable language of a person who believed they were speaking privately to someone who was as compromised as they were was enough. It was more than enough. Torres had his testimony. The arrest happened simultaneously at 0600 hours on a Monday across 3 locations. Elliot Vance was taken from his man office building as he arrived for what his assistant's calendar described as an early client meeting. He came to the door in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary and looked at the FBI agents with the expression of a man who had spent 15 years building walls and had just discovered that walls, however well constructed, cannot actually stop time. Deputy Director Sandra Okafor was arrested at her home in Bethesda. She said nothing from the moment the agents identified themselves to the moment she was in the vehicle. Not a word. The silence of a person who had prepared for this possibility and was executing her preparation with the same discipline she'd brought to everything else. General Calvin Marsh was arrested at Army Material Command Headquarters in Huntsville, Alabama. He was in uniform. He looked, according to the agent who made the arrest, as if he'd been expecting it for some time and was almost relieved that the waiting was finished. General Richard Harrove was not arrested that morning because Harrove was not in his office, not at his residence, and not at any of the 3 secondary locations that Torres's team had identified as possible alternatives. He had been at his DI office as recently as Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, he was simply gone with a clean, practiced disappearance of a man who had been in the intelligence community long enough to understand that disappearing, done correctly, required almost no drama at all. Cassandra heard about Harrove's absence from Torres at 0630 hours. She was already moving by 0635. What she knew about Harrove that Torres's file didn't fully capture because it wasn't in any official record. She knew because of Brennan. Brennan, who had served alongside Harrove in the early 2000s, who had spent enough time in institutional proximity to him to develop the specific accurate read on a person that comes not from intelligence files, but from years of professional contact. Brennan had told Cassandra about Harrove once in passing during a conversation about something else entirely. The way significant things were sometimes delivered sideways, almost accidentally. He's a place in the Ozarks, Brennan had said, not his name, not his family's. A corporate holding from the early days of his contracting work has never sold it. I've always thought it was because he understood that someday he'd need somewhere that wasn't connected to anything. The Ozarks, specifically a property in the Misery Hill country east of Table Rock Lake, registered to a dissolved LLC that traced back to a defense technology company that Harrove had been a minority investor in before his career made such connections a conflict of interest. He divested on paper. The property had remained. Cassandra had found it on day 3 of building her working document. She flagged it as a low-priority lead, and then on day 17 had pulled it back up and moved it to the top of the document just in case. She called Sullivan from the car. "Ozarks, I'm sending coordinates." "I'm 4 hours behind you," Sullivan said. "Wait for me. I'll wait as long as I can." "Cassandra, 4 hours," she said. "I'll wait 4 hours." She paused. "Bring Callaway CTA 3 till the 500 words. That's the kind of problem-solving that separates survivors from casualties. Knowing that the one piece of information the files don't contain is the piece that matters most. If you're nodding right now, if you're thinking I would never have thought to look there, subscribe. We showcase human intelligence and precision in impossible situations every single week. In this final confrontation, you haven't seen anything yet. Watch this. The Ozarks property was 80 acres of dense Misery Hill country, accessible by a single-lane gravel road that wound through second-growth oak and hickory for 2 miles before opening onto a clearing that held a main structure, a detached garage, and a dock on a narrow arm of the lake. Remote, self-sufficient, designed, as Brennan had suspected, for exactly this purpose. Cassandra arrived at the property edge at 1,340 hours and spent 40 minutes on observation before Sullivan and Callaway arrived. In those 40 minutes, she established 3 things. First, Hog Grove was present. A vehicle in the garage, lights in the main structure, and 1 instance of movement visible through the ground floor window at the 20-minute mark. Second, he was alone. No additional vehicles, no evidence of a support element, no perimeter security beyond what a single man could establish. Third, he was not preparing to run further. He was preparing to wait. The smoke from the chimney, the lights, the vehicle in the garage rather than position for rapid egress. This was a man who had reached his final position and decided to hold it, which told Cassandra something important about Hog Grove psychology. He was not ultimately a man who ran. He was a man who controlled. And when controlling was no longer possible, he would hold ground rather than accept the indignity of being chased. She could work with that. Sullivan and Callaway came through the tree line at 1,423 hours. Callaway was carrying the Remington 700. He'd had it in his vehicle since Montana, cleaned and maintained, as if he understood instinctively that it wasn't done being useful. Sullivan had his standard loadout. Both of them took in the property with a systematic, unhurried assessment of people who had done this enough times that urgency and thoroughness were not in conflict. "Callaway, I want you on the high ground above the garage. Full view of the front door and the dock approach." She pointed to the ridge line on the property's eastern edge. 400 meters. Clean shot on anyone coming out of the main entrance. Callaway nodded and moved. "Sullivan, you take the dock side. If he goes for the boat, you're the stop." "And you?" Sullivan asked. "Front door?" she said. Sullivan looked at her with a particular expression he'd been developing since Colorado. The one that contained a full argument compressed into a single look. She returned it with the expression she'd been returning since Colorado, which acknowledged the argument completely and declined it respectfully. He moved to the dockside. Cassandra walked to the front door of the main structure and knocked. The pause before the door opened was long enough to tell her that Harrove had heard the knock, had processed it, and had decided something in that processing that had taken 22 seconds to resolve. When he opened it, He was holding a glass of what appeared to be bobbin, and he was wearing civilian clothes. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had moved past surprise. Either because he'd been expecting this, or because he'd been in the intelligence community long enough that surprise had ceased to be a productive response to anything. General Richard Hargrove was 63 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a particular physical solidity of a large man whose body had been disciplined for decades and was still carrying the residue of that discipline. His hair was gray and short. His eyes were the color and approximate warmth of river granite. He looked at Cassandra Westfield, he said. His voice was measured, unsurprised. General, he stepped back from the door. An invitation or the calculation of a man who had already assessed his options and found them limited. She entered. The interior was clean and warm. The fire in the stone hearth burning with the settled, comfortable quality of a fire that had been burning for some time. Books on the shelves, a communication setup on the table near the window, laptop, satellite phone, external drive that he had clearly been using before she arrived. "You know Torres as Vance," she said. "I know." He moved to the chair beside the half, sat down without being invited to, and gestured to the opposite chair with the slight habitual authority of a man who had spent 40 years being the person who decided where other people sat today. She didn't sit. "Okafor and Marsh," she continued. "Arrested this morning, also know." He looked at the fire. Elliot built something impressive. I'll give him that. 15 years of clean operation. 6 cells of financial structure that should have been a tie to pause. Shouldn't have used the same accounting firm for hard-grow shells. That was a mistake I flagged 3 years ago. He didn't listen. Architects rarely do. The word came out with a specific controlled bitterness that told her the relationship between Hargrove and Vance had not been entirely comfortable. Elliot's philosophy was that the network was self-correcting, that no single point of failure could cascade. He was wrong about that. As it turns out, the Rangers in Colorado, Cassandra said she kept her voice even professional. She was not here for sentiment, and she was not here for anger. And both of those things were present in her, and she was managing both of them with the same discipline she applied to a crosswind at 1,300 m. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Cross's operation," he said. "Finally, I knew about it. I authorized the Shepherd protocol activation." He looked up from the fire and met her eyes for the first time since she'd entered. "I didn't authorize the execution methodology. That was Cross's operational decision. That's a very fine distinction." "It is." He didn't flinch from it. "I have spent the last 4 months deciding whether it's a distinction that matters. I haven't reached a conclusion." She pulled out her phone, placed it on the table between them, and pressed record visibly. She wanted him to see it. "Then let me help you reach one. You're going to tell me everything, Vance. The network architecture, the remaining 5 cells, the financial structure, the foreign buyers, everything on record. And then you're going to come with me voluntarily, and you're going to say all of it again in front of Torres and a federal magistrate. And if I don't, then the man on the ridge behind your garage shoots out your satellite phone and your vehicle tires, and we wait here until federal agents arrive in approximately 3 hours, and you have this conversation under arrest instead of voluntarily." She paused. Voluntary cooperation has a significantly different sentencing outcome. You know that better than I do. Hargrove looked at the phone on the table, looked at the fire, looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had made a great many decisions over a long career and was now at the end of it in the specific position of a person who had run out of decisions that didn't involve consequences. He set down his bourbon glass. "There are things about the network's foreign buyer relationships," he said slowly, "that go significantly deeper than what Torres's financial investigation has found. Things that if they became public without proper management would create an international incident of considerable scale." "That's not my problem," Cassandra said. "That's the State Department's problem." A long pause. The fire crackled. Outside the Missouri Hill country was winter quiet and vast. "All right," Hargrove said, and he began to talk. He talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He talked about Vance and the network's true architecture. Not the 7 cells Torres had identified, but 9, 2 of them entirely outside domestic jurisdiction, operating through foreign defense, contracting relationships in Eastern Europe and the Gulf region. He talked about the foreign buyers, Not just regional actors acquiring surplus inventory, but two state-level intelligence services that had been purchasing specific technical equipment through the network for 3 years. Equipment whose export would have required congressional notification under normal channels. He talked about the $380 million figure that had appeared in the hard drive documentation, and he said it was wrong. The actual figure across all 9 cells and the full operational timeline was closer to $940 million. The discrepancy was in the foreign transactions, which had been kept in a separate accounting structure that Aldrich Cell had no visibility on. He talked about Shepard Protocol's origins, not repurposed contingency planning as Cross had described, but something more deliberate, a framework that Vance had designed from scratch in 2008 and spent 3 years pitching quietly to senior officials he had identified as potentially receptive. Most had declined, 3 had not. He talked finally and with the careful precision of a man who had decided that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it completely about the names of the 2 Foreign Intelligence Service contacts. Names that when Cassandra relayed them to Torres 4 hours later, produced a silence on the other end of the line that lasted 6 full seconds before Torres said very quietly that he was going to need to make several calls before they discussed next steps. Hog Grove came voluntarily. He walked out of the Ozarks property at 1:79 hours with his hands visible and his pace measured, and the specific contained dignity of a man who had decided that the manner in which he surrendered was the last thing he controlled, and he was going to control it carefully. Calloway came down from the ridge. Sullivan came in from the dockside. The 4 of them stood for a moment in the winter light of the Missouri clearing, and no one said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment didn't already contain. Then Cassandra put Harrove in the vehicle and drove south. The full indictments took 4 months. Vance Okafor Marsh Harrove, federal charges across 17 counts with a Foreign Intelligence Service connection, generating a parallel classified proceeding that would operate in a courtroom most people would never hear about. The 9-cell network was systematically dismantled cell by cell using the combination of hard drive documentation. Cross's cooperation, Okafor's eventual partial cooperation in exchange for sentencing consideration, and Hagro's comprehensive deposition, which ran to 412 pages and was, Torres told Cassandra, the most operationally complete account of a domestic corruption network that the FBI's Organized Crime Division had ever received. The $940 million figure was confirmed. Recovery proceedings were initiated across 6 domestic jurisdictions and 3 foreign ones. India's note had said the network had 6 remaining functional nodes. By the end of the 4th month, 5 had been dismantled. The 6th, the Eastern European cell operating through a defense contracting front in Warsaw, remained active, its leadership having dispersed across 3 countries in the weeks following Vance's arrest. Operating with the specific cold patience of people who had been trained to survive exactly this kind of institutional collapse. They were still out there. One Fred still running. Yeah, sometimes the universe tests us beyond what seems survivable. And sometimes victory comes with an asterisk. If you're feeling that weight right now, if you're thinking it's never truly over, that's exactly why you need to subscribe. Because the human capacity to endure, to adapt, to keep going when the fight isn't finished. You haven't seen anything yet, and neither has Cassandra. Continuing, the Medal of Honor ceremony happened on a Thursday afternoon in February. Fort Bragg, the kin. D of cold that is polite about it. Not the killing cold of the Rockies or the damn cold of the Ozarks, but the formal ceremonial cold of a mid-Atlantic winter that knows it is backdrop rather than character. Cassandra stood in her dress uniform in a row that included Sullivan, Calloway, Hayes, and Merrick. Merrick fully recovered, ribs healed, standing with a squared shoulder bearing of a man who had decided somewhere in his recovery that he was done with being anything other than entirely upright. Colonel Victoria Brennan stood at the front of the room. She was in full dress uniform, every ribbon and device in its precise location. The Remington 700 nowhere in evidence, but somehow present anyway, in the posture, in the bearing, in the specific quality of stillness that the colonel brought to every room she occupied. Her left lung had healed completely. The surgeon had said she had the recovery capacity of someone 20 years younger, to which Brennan had responded that she'd been training for this specific outcome for 32 years, and she expected the biology to cooperate. The citation was read by a brigadier general who had the careful, slightly formal delivery of someone who understood that what he was reading was a document correcting a significant institutional wrong and was choosing to read it with the weight that required. It addressed the events of 4 years prior, the classified operation in which Brennan had been reported killed, the subsequent false designation of treason that had been applied to her operational record as part of the network's containment strategy, and the full operational account of what she had actually been doing in the period before her reported death. She had been building the case for 4 years, reported dead, operating under a false identity with resources she'd accumulated before the network burned her official status. She had been doing exactly what she had always done, being precisely right, with insufficient support and sufficient stubbornness to make it matter. The medal was placed around her neck by a 4-star general who had authorized the investigation that Brennan's 4 years of work had ultimately made possible. Brennan stood through with her back straight and her hands still. When the ceremony ended, Cassandra crossed the room and stood in front of her mentor. Brennan looked at her with a winter sky eyes that had seen everything worth seeing and had not been softened by any of it. "The Warsaw cell," Brennan said, because that was Brennan. The ceremony was over and the operational world reasserted itself immediately, naturally without transition. Still active. Torres has a contact in Polish intelligence working on locating the leadership. Timeline unknown, a beat months possibly. Brennan nodded, the particular nod of a person filing information into a working problem. And Anna, since the index card, she'll surface when she has something worth surfacing for. Brennan looked at the medal then, at Cassandra, the shepherd's design. 9 cells, 3 generals, 15 years of careful construction. We've dismantled 7 of it in 6 months. 7 out of 9. With a team of 5 operating off the books and 1 FBI agent running a parallel track. The faintest suggestion of something that in a person less disciplined would have been a smile. Not terrible, Westfield. Cassandra looked at her, the woman who had written the field manual, who had called in a favor when a mission smelled wrong and had refused to tell her fully why. Because the field was where she did her best work, who had taken a round in a Colorado snowfield and told her from the ground to get the shooter and secure the drive, because the drive mattered more. "You could have told me," Cassandra said. It was an accusation. It was finally just the observation. It had always been the honest accounting between a teacher and a student who had come all the way through something together. "I could have told you many things," Brennan said, at many points under different circumstances that would have changed the way this went. She held Cassandra's gaze. "But you were trained to handle what I didn't tell you. That's the point of training. A long beat. The Warsaw cell." Cassandra said yes. "When Torres's contact has a location, you'll need someone who knows the D's Eastern European operational methodology." Brennan straightened almost imperceptibly, the way she always did when a decision had been made and the decision was forward. "I know it rather well." Cassandra felt something shift in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite resolved, but lived in the territory between them. The particular alignment that happens when the people you trust most are pointing in the same direction you are. You just received the Medal of Honor. She said the DOD will have paperwork for you. "The DOD can wait," Brennan said. 3 weeks later, a secure message arrived on Cassandra's encrypted secondary phone, the one that wasn't registered to anything, the one she carried out of habit Brennan had drilled into her, the habit of always having a way out that no one knew about. The message had no sender identification, no greeting. For lines. "Warsaw cell has moved. New operational base. Krakow. Cell leadership. 3 individuals. 1 is known to you. I will be in position when you arrive. Don't be slow." Cassandra read it twice. Then she looked out the window of the Arlington apartment at the city going about its evening. Ordinary, continuous, unaware. The lights of 1,000 windows in 1,000 buildings occupied by 1,000 lives that had no particular knowledge of the machinery operating beneath the surface of the world they inhabited. No particular knowledge of the 7-year financial network that had been treating the security apparatus of their country as a private revenue stream. No particular knowledge of the Rangers in the Colorado snow, or the mountain that had tried to erase them, or the woman who had refused to let it. She picked up her phone and called Sullivan. "How fast can you get to Arlington?" she asked. A pause. The sound of something being set down. Then, with the exact same cadence he'd used the last time she'd asked. 8 hours less if I break things. Break things? She said she was already packing. The victory in the Colorado Rockies had been real. Let that remain clear because it mattered in the full, unambiguous sense that genuine wins in long wars matter. For Rangers had names again. A general had chains. A woman had her honor restored in the building where that honor had been stolen. And the financial architecture of 7 criminal cells had been reduced to ledger entries in federal evidence storage. These are not small things. People had died for them, and the living had paid every kind of cost that isn't death, but runs close enough to it that the difference on certain nights required some deliberate effort to perceive. But the war was not over. The wall was what it had always been. Patient, adaptive, deeper than any single operation could reach. Built into the structure of institutions large enough that a cancer could grow in them for 15 years before the body noticed. The shepherd had designed it that way. 9 cells, 3 generals, layers upon layers of insulation, each one designed to survive the collapse of the one below it. 7 cells down, 2 still running, 1 thread leading east to a city in southern Poland where 3 people with operational knowledge and no remaining institutional protection were doing what the network had always done when threatened, adapting, waiting, planning, and somewhere in the peripheral distance. In the space between known and unknown that Cassandra had navigated her entire career, a Russian contract sniper with a healed right shoulder and a talent for appearing at precisely the moment when her particular skills are most needed was already in position, waiting for Cassandra to be not slow. The Ghost of the Valley picked up her kit bag, slung the Remington 700 over her shoulder because it was haze now earned in Colorado snow, and carried through Missouri winter and across the full complicated distance of the past 7 months, and walked to the door. She did not look back at the apartment. She did not look back at the 4 to 7 page working document on the monitors, or the index card on the kitchen table, or the photograph of the Arlington night that existed only in her memory. The city going about its ordinary business in the long, patient shadow of what lay beneath it. She had a position to reach. She had adjustments to calculate. And she had learned in 12 years and 1 very long autumn that the mountain doesn't give you an ending. It gives you a ridge. And from the ridge, if you are patient enough and precise enough and willing to pay the full cost of seeing clearly, you can see exactly what needs to happen next. Cassandra Westfield walked out into the February morning and didn't stop walking. The Ghost of the Valley was still moving. The war was waiting. And she had never once been late to a fight that mattered.